So I'm not going to be able to do justice to this particular topic, but I'm going to try anyway. I'm going to try and just add my 2 cents worth, for what it's worth, about my experience with close friendships with trans women and how brave they are, how amazing they are that they have to endure the pushback that they endure, even from those that call themselves left. It saddens me that I have to witness some folks on the left having a go at trans women and basically just outright transphobia. Because I know, for one, they don't understand the issue. They probably never even met somebody who's trans. They've probably never even met someone who's trans, let alone got to know them, let alone understood where they're coming from and what it's like, and their childhood, and how much suffering they've had to endure, all because of, one, ignorance, and two, a vehement defense, a vehement defending of the binary. Heaven forbid we should step outside the binary. I'm not sure why it's so threatening to people that anything outside this normative, the heteronormative paradigm, why it's so threatening. And I'm not sure why it has been ramped up so much in recent times by those who claim to be on the left, and yet I've heard the most ignorant things. I'm not talking about small, tiny things. I'm talking about ignorant things, really ignorant and kind of hateful. So let's sort of think about where this could be coming from. Why some folks who claim to be for human rights, and trans rights are human rights, why there seems to be this fear and threat. Literally, people seem to be literally threatened and seem to think there's some sort of a trans agenda. A little bit like when LGBT people were getting sort of rights. It was like this, the gay agenda. There's always some agenda, isn't there? There's never an agenda, though, when you're afraid that, like that saying goes, I'm going to sort of murder that saying in a way, but that saying that sort of says equality feels like oppression to those who are the dominant paradigm. Now, that's not how the saying goes, but that's pretty much what I take from that. And so it's okay, for example, when, say, gay people, they're allowed to marry. That was fun for me. Not that I want to get married, but having to fill out a survey that my government put out asking the public, who are mostly heterosexual, whether I should be allowed to marry. Whether I should be allowed to marry my partner. Now, I'm not a trans person, but being from the LGBT community and coming out, I came out in 83. I was 23 years old. So that's a long time to wait for this ability to get married. Like, woohoo. I mean, I'm really not that interested in it, in those particular, that particular thing. I'm not interested in getting married, and I don't need to get married to validate my relationship. I don't need a piece of paper, and I don't need to prove to anyone in society. Now, that's getting away from what I started talking about, but this is an example of when, for example, gay people have, when they start to go beyond that being allowed to marry, that's when the shit hits the fan, because then you're just getting too uppity. You're expecting society to give you other, to be acknowledged and to be respected as any other person in society. And if you want equality in the true sense of that word, and people have to maybe not call you a dyke, not that that's a problematic word for women who have same-sex attractions. It's not like that word's been reclaimed, but when it's used by someone in a pejorative sense, of course, they think that it's hurtful. But I mean, what I'm trying to say is that when people have to start watching their P's and Q's towards LGBT people, that's when it starts to become problematic for them. When it's okay to throw a few crumbs to LGBT people, you should be happy with those crumbs and shut the fuck up. Now back to trans people. Now we've switched from the whole gay agenda, which people found problematic. They didn't want LGBT people to be able to get married. They want them to vanish, really. They want them to go back to some kind of hole or remain in this second-class citizen thing. And that's usually driven by the so-called Christian, in quotes, right, and they use that as a political tool. Now we have the same people in Australia, for example, and I was witness to this when I was an ally and part of the Transforming Tasmania campaign, which was to get equal rights, at least the basic equal rights for trans people, and have legislation changed, and we spent 1.5 years working on that. The hatred that came through some of the right-wing politicians here, and the different tropes that they put out, and the TERFs, the trans-exclusive radical feminists, and I put feminists in quotes because I don't believe anyone who is transphobic can be a feminist. Anybody who is exclusive like that, excluding a group, can't be a feminist. So those TERFs, I'll call them TERFs for this just so that it's clear in this video, but they're really just transphobic women. These transphobic women, I'm not sure what their problem is, but they never ever get to know trans women. They never ever get to know their story. They never ever get to hear their childhood stories of what that was like for them. And people often that write about trans women and have a lot to say that is negative, they never ever really understand the issue, and all they want to do is put out their bias, their bigotry, and they have no intentions of understanding it. That's my experience of people who are transphobic. They usually are committed to that position, and they have no intentions and do not want to understand it. Now back to where I started about how amazing these brave trans women are. Back in the 80s, I remember when I first came in contact with trans women was actually through a friend who owned a nightclub. And of course, it's very difficult for trans women who grew up and didn't have access to the hormones and all of that, the androgen blockers and all of that kind of thing. They didn't have access to all of that, so basically their bodies continued to grow, and it actually became, it was very difficult for them to pass, meaning it was very difficult for them to be read. It was very difficult for them to be read as female. And so a lot of trans women in the 80s, for example, couldn't get everyday work because it was sometimes a bit difficult to read them as female, and they'd be seen as freaks. And so they would end up sometimes going and becoming strippers, and that's where or sometimes sex workers, or something where some job that they could get, no matter how qualified they were for other things, they could not get that work because they weren't passable enough. This is our ridiculous norms of what's female and what's male, what that looks like, in the whole constructed gender stereotypes of what is male behavior, what is female behavior, what looks like male, what looks like female, yada, 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 yada. It gives me a headache. I would like to see all these gender things just thrown out, really. I think they create a lot of harm for children and also later in life. But anyway, that's for another video, and I'm not really qualified to talk about that. I'll have to ask somebody close to me who's trans to talk about that issue. So, but I've become aware over the years. I met, for example, as I was saying, I met a few trans women who were working in a stripper club in the 80s called World by Night, and lovely, lovely women, and they did very well in that stripper bar, and they were very passable. That was my first introduction to trans people. Then I met somebody else who they did a sort of a kind of a fake wedding ceremony in King George Square in the 80s with a cisgendered woman, and they were sort of pretending to get married, and I had a little bit to do with that trans woman. And then meeting trans women in Sydney in the early 2000s. So I've known a number of trans women over time. And then you see online, for example, I want to bring to your attention ContraPoints, 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 who is Natalie Wynn. Natalie Wynn is a trans woman who's recently transitioned, and she's got some really great videos. They're not just about trans issues, but if you want to understand somebody if you want to understand those issues, she actually does it in a kind of a dialogue between different characters. She dresses up in different characters and does a dialogue between, and kind of has opposing viewpoints. Like she'll have a character called Tiffany Tumbles, who is like a self-hating trans woman. She'll have right-wing characters, sort of left-wing. She has a whole lot of different characters, and I'm not completely familiar with all the content on her channel because it's only something I came across in the last probably 2 months. So I haven't really been able to, I haven't had the time to go through all her different videos. But Natalie Wynn is really somebody very interesting, that if you do not understand trans issues and you want to sort of see her do these really amazing videos that she puts a lot of time into, like she spends weeks and weeks researching these issues, and they're not just about trans issues either, so it's actually very interesting. So she spent a long time doing research, though, and talking about trans issues because she's transitioning and she's dealing with that. And so it actually gives this sort of a journey, basically. You're watching her journey, and she only just recently took down a bunch of her earlier videos where she was before she transitioned, because she said she found it difficult to watch. And I can appreciate why that would be. But in some way, and so I never really got to see those. I got to see a little bit of it, but I can see that she would have trouble seeing those videos, because that probably also represents some pain, and also she probably cannot relate to her physical appearance there anymore, and so forth. But I really would urge you to go and check out ContraPoints on YouTube. She has quite a lot of subscribers now, and I'm not surprised, because there's so much effort is put into her videos, And also there's a lot of trans women and trans men who probably really appreciate that she is putting it out there, and she's very self-deprecating at the same time. So she's not precious at all, and she just she's very candid about her feelings about her journey as a trans woman, and expressing her fears, and sometimes it's very hard to watch because she's so candid and so honest. And yet I'm already familiar with the struggles, just hearing about it from close trans friends of mine. And I couldn't, as a cisgendered woman, it's very difficult for me to, it would be impossible for me to truly appreciate what it's like to be a trans person and to grow up trans, and to grow up in a society that is still very ignorant about this, and that includes, as I've said, sadly, people on the left. Some people on the left. I'm so glad that the people that I tend to follow, for example, journalists on the left that I follow, are not that way. And I'm talking about Abby Martin, who's actually, they did a thing on trans rights on the Empire Files. And her close friends, I don't imagine that they are transphobic either. The other journalists like Max Blumenthal, I know that Ben Norton isn't, and Anya Poundful, all those people, I think I doubt very much whether they would be transphobic. And it's interesting, I find it interesting. I know I'm meandering all over the place, but I'm sort of trying to make some points. And as I said, I'm not going to do justice to this at all, but I just want to say something, because this is really important for me, for people to stop being ignorant about this issue and to stop seeing it as some sort of threat or some sort of made-up thing, or that they're being oppressed because trans people, I mean, people make out like it's all about pronouns. That's what the media wants you to believe, because they want to stir up another form of drama. It's not about pronouns. That's just a small part of it. It's not about that at all, and yet the right-wing media in particular are making out like people can go to prison for misgendering people. It's just such nonsense, and they even tried to put that out there here when we were doing that campaign, Transforming Tasmania. They're even the TERFs and the right-wing politicians were trying to fearmonger about all sorts of things, and one of them was going to prison for misgendering. I mean, truly and really unbelievable. Anyway, so I think Natalie Wynn is incredibly brave to be putting herself out there. She's got 1 million or so subscribers. I think putting herself out there like that, and of course, you know, there's no shortage of misogynists and transphobes, and that's all rolled into one. There's no shortage of people like that on the internet. There's no shortage of men's groups that go around looking for women to shit all over. There's no shortage of TERFs doing the same thing. I think she's incredibly brave, and there are other trans women on YouTube who are maybe not as passable as Natalie. As I say, passable means this fitting into this very narrow idea of what a woman is supposed to look like, which most women don't look like anyway. I mean, most women, I know in Tasmania, you rarely see any women even wearing dresses, and yet we go to these public bathrooms and here we've got icons of, you know, stick figures with skirts on. Most women I know don't dress, they don't even wear makeup. Most women I know, I mean, when I was nursing, most nurses never wear makeup. They did it so that makeup didn't come off their face and into wounds or anything like that, but also they just didn't, you know, even outside of nursing, they didn't do that. Most women wear jeans, you know, so there's all these norms. There's all these, this very tight little stereotype that that a lot of women don't subscribe to or don't actually fit into. And that includes, there's a lot of men too who are desperately trying to stick to a certain type of, so that people won't pick on them and leave them alone. And as I say, it's incredibly oppressive, and it also comes out sideways in all sorts of things. I'm just talking about trans people today, but it's all part of it, the binary, this tight little binary that actually is not really real in a way, because there is so much more to gender and sexuality and all of that in the world today. So much more, and always has been. So we paint ourselves into a corner, but basically we're painting other people into a corner and making their life miserable. And that's an intentional thing to punish them for stepping outside of this heteronormativity basically. So I've covered Natalie Wynn, and I hope you check her out because I think she's incredibly brave, and I also think she's very intelligent and witty and funny, self-deprecating, and sometimes even a little shocking. And she's so that's someone you can check out. As far as people that I know in real life, my experience of when I hear about the difficulties that trans people have had in their life, whether it's abuse, literally, where people have hit them with steel poles or have raped them. All these kinds of awful misogynist acts of violence, transphobic acts of violence, all because somebody is different. And I talk about different quite often on this channel, the difference, and I talk about speciesism and racism and sexism and heterosexism, ableism, classism, all forms of the same violence. They're all faces of the same violence. They all cause violence, and where you have one form, you'll have all forms. And I often talk about how with speciesism, where you have a non-vegan public, where we are speciesists, that can only lead to other forms of violence. When you're oppressing a vulnerable group to the large degree that non-human animals are, it can't not affect everything. When there's terrible violence towards so many non-human animals. This is all about difference because they're different. They're another species. They're still sentient, despite being another species. But they're different. It's an otherization of a whole group that happens to live on this planet. A whole massive group, 99.99% of the planet's population. We've decided because they're different and because we can oppress them, that we do oppress them and we do eat, wear, and use them. And then with trans women, we've gone from LGBT, this is also misogynist, and it's also, because trans men don't get killed at the rate that trans women do. And particularly black trans women in the United States are killed at an alarming rate. There's been quite a few already this year in 2020. Every year there's probably about 30 black trans women, something like that, killed. Just murdered because they're trans women. It's like when you have men, for example, who are outside of this very tight and destructive stereotype of what men should be, right? So gay men are targets of violence because if they're slightly outside of that, or that they're not fitting into that particular stereotype, then they become targets of violence. It's almost like it's a mistaken view that trans women are a step further than that. They're taking that to the nth degree, this mistaken view and so it becomes this sort of like, it becomes a really distorted and weird kind of a reaction. But it's also misogynist too. There's a huge amount of misogyny in society, even within women, internalized misogyny. And there are women who are just sort of against trans women. I don't even think they even unconsciously understand why they are so angry. But I just know for myself that what are people afraid of, really? Ever since I've met the first trans person that I ever met, I just thought, okay, because you just live and let live. Who are they harming? Are they harming anybody? They're not harming anybody. They're just living, and they're having enough trouble trying to live in a transphobic, heteronormative society. They're having enough trouble with that. And then we compound that to the nth degree with all the negative messaging and the misogyny and the TERFs that are just transphobic women that need to get a grip. They're not feminists at all. All of that just piled on top of these people who are already having to deal with living an authentic life as a trans person. And I've never really been able to understand the level of hatred and fear-mongering. It's like there always seems to have to be a group to hate globally. There has to always be somebody that we look down upon. We have to feel superior in some way, or right and good, and we're normal, in quotes, and those people are not normal, and we have to wipe them out. And we don't literally do it. Sometimes we do by killing, but sometimes we just make it so unbearable that they want to kill themselves, or that they are driven away and end up in small cliques and have to be away from society. We find ways of hammering them till they either want to kill themselves or somebody else kills them because they have gotten that message that they're wrong and bad, that they want to kill them. And what for? And I've seen some dreadful transphobia from the left. One person I won't call out, but I was watching their live stream and they were talking about Obama having, and this is their words, having a cross-dressing transsexual nanny. This is Barack Obama had a cross-dressing transsexual nanny. And then he said, then the person who was hosting the live stream said, what's up with that? You know, meaning, what the fuck is that? And, you know, like as if that's just awful on so many levels. And this is somebody, you know, who's a left, who claims to be on the left and a socialist. And I was just amazed at the level of ignorance with that statement. And when I challenged them, they said, I have no opinion on trans people. Well, that says everything. That's like a non-committal, that sort of tells me that they have real issues, that they say, I have no opinion. And this is very common, like people, you find that people will, even when they're talking about LGBT people, they'll talk about gay and lesbian things, but they'll leave trans people out. They just leave them out because it's in the too hard basket. That's more common than not, leaving trans people out of the picture. I mean, there's some very well-known UK presenter, George Galloway, who has been showing how transphobic he is lately. And I find that really sad. Really sad. And I challenged him on Twitter and he blocked me. See, when I say people are committed to that ignorance, they really are. Like I suggested, why don't you have somebody on your show, on the mother of all talk shows, why don't you have somebody on your show and they can, you know, who's trans, who's, you know, sort of is a good speaker and they can talk about it, you know, get somebody to talk about it. But this is the thing. People aren't interested in understanding it. They're committed to that ignorance. They're committed to that position. Somehow it makes them feel like a lesser man or something if they accept a trans person, or if they accept that there are more than just two genders on the planet, that somehow diminishes them, or diminishes their children, or diminishes us as a species. This has been going on. Trans people have existed for thousands of years. If people did any research at all, they would see that. But they're not interested in research. I saw a politician in Parliament, I think I can't remember his name right now. He gave a speech in Parliament when we were doing the legislation. It was last year. And he had more of an understanding of these issues. He'd obviously done a lot of research and talked to people. And he was saying stuff that most people on the left don't know. And I just thought, that's fantastic. And you can find that speech on Faint Signals from Vega. Just go to there's a trans playlist, just go to that and have a look at his speech. And there's a couple of other speeches too. So if that man, who was a older white man, he was probably, I don't know, in his 60s, probably even his 70s, a very kind of very usual, typical looking white straight man in Parliament, kind of gruff looking in a way, if he can understand those issues and not be threatened by it and actually stand up for trans people, surely people on the left here that are like probably half his age or a third of his age can get their head around this. Look into everything you want to look into from a reliable source, right? Try, actual trans organizations. They don't have an agenda. They just want people to feel safe. They just want trans people to feel safe. They want trans people to have access to good medical help, and hormones and all of that, and to be safe from harm, and to be respected and given equality. These are all things that we all want. I want that. Everybody wants to feel equal in society. Nobody wants to feel like a second-class citizen or that we're going to be targets of violence. I've explained how I became a target of violence when I came out to a good friend of mine, a good male friend of mine, who raped me basically after I came out to him. That was in the early 80s. It's sort of, that's what happens when homophobia leads to violence. Transphobia leads to violence. And in many cases leads to people being murdered. So, it's no small thing to be throwing out transphobic comments about things we don't know, about an issue we don't know nothing about really, or that we have such a bias that all we do is look for things that are wrong, pretend like it's all about misgendering people, and that's all that it's about, or pretend like that trans women are going to go into bathrooms and murder people or something, or harass women in bathrooms. No, it's actually the other way around. Trans people get killed in bathrooms, and that whole idea is a complete nonsense. It is fabricated by the right. If a man wants to rape women, they don't need to put on a dress and pretend they're trans. They just go and do it. I mean, seriously. They'll just go into a bathroom and kill a woman or rape a woman, right? They don't need to dress up like women. Whatever, I mean, this is the thing. These are all bullshit right-wing myths that are put out by transphobic women that call themselves radical feminists. There's no proof of that. There's a report actually that is just completely debunks that whole BS. Trans women are not men who like to cross-dress. They're not. And I really would love to see left commentators start to interview trans people that have a good understanding of the issues. Not every trans person understands all the issues or is even very political. Then most trans people just want to be left alone. They want to blend in. They don't want to have any problems, and they don't want to be talking about something that really they're just trying to live their life, live a happy, safe life, and be accepted by other people. They don't want to be tolerated. They just want to be accepted. That's all. And I've never had a problem with trans people, ever. And even before I really got to know a trans woman in any close way, I was fine with it, because why not? Why not be fine with it? What is it? What sort of threat is it to you or anybody? What threat is it to me? There's no threat. It's okay. And in fact, diversity is a healthy thing. Like, diversity shows a healthy society. If you've just got a bunch of white people running around, that's a worry. Like, I'm always glad, Tasmania is quite white. There's a lot of white people here. And I've noticed over the last 5 or 10 years, it's actually started changing a bit. And I think, thank goodness, because that worries me. When there's too many white people, it's just like it's overrun with white people. That can be a problem. We white people can be problematic. We have been problematic. Just look at the imperialist wars and this white replacement theory shit that's going around, and trying to stamp on anybody that's different. The whole white thing and the heteronormative thing together, it's not pretty. Heterosexism is not pretty. So, we have to ask ourselves, really, really ask ourselves, if we're having trouble with trans people, firstly, educate oneself about those issues from a reliable source, not from the right wing or from leftists who are just running their mouth off about stuff they don't know anything about. And even though I've had close friendships with and close relationships with trans people, doesn't mean that I'm any expert on that issue, and I don't pretend to be, and I would much rather a trans person talk about this, but I really, as a person on the left, I want to see the end of this ignorance. I do, because it's dangerous. And I have a look at Russian TV, RT.com has great stuff on anti-imperialism. It's really good for that. It has On Contact with Chris Hedges, and it has a bunch of different shows like that. It's very good with anti-imperialism stuff, but it's really, really bad these days. In the last year and a half, in particular, couple of years, it's almost like they've made some sort of editorial decision to sort of, there's transphobic stuff and some homophobic stuff and reductionist things about gender, and also it's misogynist. It's sort of shitting on feminists, and at the present time, it's kind of pushing for. It's trying to sort of frame the whole coronavirus thing in a strange way, as if I don't know, it's not great. So it's got this dichotomy. It's kind of a really good on anti-imperialism, but awful on other things. So I just try not to look at it. If I want to check out some stuff, I just ignore some of the editorial nonsense on there. That's where things can go. That's how it can sort of be taken up. It's almost like in our species' nature to want to have some sort of homogenized thing, and anything outside of what we consider or we consider as different, we want to stamp it out or something. And it's a very rigid way of thinking, and it also leads to other forms of violence. These things are never on their own. You can almost guarantee that people are transphobic, have other issues. They probably also have misogynist stuff. They have anti-feminist stuff. They try and pick the most sort of rigid feminists they can find and use that as an example of feminism and all that kind of thing. Or, pick Caitlyn Jenner as an example of a trans woman, or someone who is some kind of a meltdown in a store and they happen to be trans. They'll use them as an example. I mean, it's sad. It's just sad. It's sad, and it's so unnecessary, and I just see so much pain caused by it. So much pain. And I wish it would stop. So much pain. Why do we cause so much pain? On people who, what have they done? Haven't they had enough pain? Haven't they had enough? Haven't they had enough to deal with? Having to deal with their parents not accepting them, or even kicking them out of home, as one close friend that happened to them. Kicking them out of home, abusing them sexually and everything, kind of like a punishment. Messed up. Haven't they had enough pain? Can't we support them as people on the left to be inclusive? To be inclusive. There is no threat. The only threat is up here. And what sort of threat is that? What kind of threat is it? Nobody is a loser to be inclusive and to protect the vulnerable. No one is a loser. We all win. As the title of this goes, I have the utmost respect for the strength and the courage that it takes to live your authentic self and to stand up to the level of hatred and the level of transphobia that is happening at the moment from all sides. It takes an amazing amount of courage to do that, and bravery, and particularly when, for example, Natalie Wynn was saying how depressed she is at the moment, and yet she just struggles on. She struggles on, and she just pushes back harder. And that's what needs to happen, but it's not easy when you're already struggling, dealing with a new transition self, and you have to deal with the incredible ignorance there is. And it goes beyond just that. It goes beyond name-calling. It can be physical threats of violence. So anyway, I've talked long enough. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this video to go on as long as it has. But please, let's educate ourselves on these issues. And if we are not sure, let's interview people, trans people, who can give us a good insight into these issues. And let's stop feeding into the right-wing nonsense or adding to it by being so ignorant and at best just ignoring that trans people exist. Anyway, we won't be sorry if we get ourselves together on this issue. So thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. I hope that as I said, I probably didn't do justice to this issue at all, but I just wanted to express my dismay, and also just, I just want things to change. I don't want to see it going in this ugly direction that I've seen on the left, for some people on the left. So thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Bega. Till next time, go vegan. Bye for now.